Hello, Dr. David. I'm so happy to be with you tonight.
Thanks, Tammy. It's always a pleasure to be here with you too. We have fun.
Yes, we do. So for those of you joining, I just hit record. This is recorded so that people that are not able to join us live are able to watch the videos later. You can always find the videos for all, not just this one, but any of the previously recorded webinars on sexandrelationshiphealing.com. Under the resources tab, you'll see that there's a ton of resources on there. So if you haven't perused that, please do so. And I have new exciting news that we're going to have another partner drop-in group starting in March, and it will be on attachment wounds. So it will be a guided one. We've got the men's group on Fridays, but this will be for female partners to get support around attachment wounds that they have felt, which I'm sure betrayal and abandonment and neglect and a whole bunch of other things will resonate. So excited to have that new offering coming. Stay tuned. So Dr. David's topic tonight is honesty, and last week was patience, not my favorite, but I love this topic, so I'm anxious to learn more.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's always good to be here. It's my friend Tammy, and I'm Dr. David Fawcett. If you don't know me, work with Seeking Integrity as their Vice President for Clinical Programming, and authored a book on chemsex in the gay community, and I'm soon, hopefully later this year, have one out on co-occurring drugs and sexual behavior for everybody. So men, women, gay, straight, all the drugs, not just amphetamines. So anyway, that's me, that's the work we're doing. But you know, all these topics always kind of come to me based on just kind of what I've been hearing around. And I've from clients and in meetings this week, it just seems there's a lot of talk about lying and how to move into honesty and stay in honesty. And so I think it's just worth exploring it a little bit, you know. And I think really the starting point is just to realize that an addiction requires lying. It can't exist unless there's a lot of lying and dishonesty as part of it. And therefore, you know, recovery is sort of the opposite of that, of course. But lying, in my experience, can become a relapse trigger for people. They get into that mindset. And a lot of times, a lot of addicts I've worked with talk about a history of lying for no reason for a long time, like before they ever became addicted. They just would tell little white lies or not so white lies, and it just kind of became a habit of dealing with the world. But it was this kind of disingenuousness and this disconnection from the truth that I think sets people up to fall into addiction once they get a little bit more exposed to behaviors or drugs or whatever it is. So I think that's really the key. And the thing is that we get an addict typically gets so good at lying that it's very hard sometimes to stop. It's very hard to tell kind of when they're lying. I think there's so many stories to so many people and so many different angles. And every addict I've ever talked about the energy required to kind of keep all those things in place and to remember what you said to who and who knows what, and always being careful to make sure that nobody knows the whole story, that we have to kind of keep ourselves really protected. So really, obviously, the honesty is that. Honesty is the antidote to that, if you will. And really, I found recovery requires really complete honesty. And I don't know that I knew how to do that when I first got sober. I think it was so automatic. I had defenses, I had rationalizations, I had told myself stuff. I'd lied to myself so much. And it's sort of self-gaslighting, if that's a term. I just sort of had myself, I didn't quite believe it, but I didn't really know the truth either. It was all kind of this murkiness on kind of truth on shaky ground. So I think it really requires honesty. And we know that if you're not honest, lying, it just will destroy relationships. And we see that with people that come to Seeking Integrity. We see it with people in other kinds of addictions where lying just by definition is going to your relationship is going to fall apart and be destroyed. It's really, really a toxic element, both for ourselves and for others. So honesty is really that the antidote. So I think a couple things to say about that. One thing that I think people often mistake in early recovery is that they think honesty means being honest about other people. And so it's easy to kind of judge, it's easy to feel victimized, and it's easy to kind of take an inventory, as we say in program. I think that that's a factor of just, it's so difficult to really be honest with ourselves at that point. And I believe that self-honesty is a process that really has to start by even having other people hold that space for us until we can kind of be honest with ourselves. I relied on people I counted on people to kind of be honest with me back, to reflect, to call out discrepancies, like, wait a minute, what about this, what about that? I think that's really one of the great healing forces in any kind of residential treatment program too, is the honesty you're going to get from peers, because you can expose yourself and be open, and people are going to be honest with you in return. And sometimes I think the pathway toward honesty is often being reflected in from other people, that we can't see it itself first. So people might say, you're a warm person, or a good person, or an honest person. And if that doesn't resonate with me, and I've been telling lies or dishonest statements to kind of cover that up, or even when they say that to me, it doesn't resonate, it doesn't ring true. And so I think part of this is kind of realization and growth. And I think, which brings me to the second point, which is not going to come naturally in the beginning. I think we've spent so much time learning to lie that telling the truth is kind of this automatic thing that is not going to be so automatic for us. And so I think it doesn't feel natural. And so I think we have to practice. And like anything, the same thing happens if we're learning to be assertive. I think sometimes when we first do it, it can come out a little aggressive, or not assertive enough. And we're trying to find that Goldilocks spot right in the middle. But when we're new at something, we kind of stumble, and it's awkward, and it doesn't feel natural. I think being honest in all our affairs is really something that takes hard work and patience and effort and diligence. I don't think we could ever kind of cut back on it, because my disease, my addiction is really tricky. And I think, like all of ours, where it is kind of learning along with me as I go through meetings, or as I learn stuff about my addiction. There's a part of me that is getting wiser, an unhealthy part of me that's getting wiser as well. And I think I have to be really careful about what that's going to tell me, and in terms of self-talk and beliefs and thoughts. And so again, coming back to honesty, really anchoring it in as best we can. So I think one of the things too is common sense too, right? I think this is, again, and maybe in terms of talking about stuff, we have to learn some judgment. I think there's that phrase we hear sometimes, brutal honesty, where I think sometimes hearing the fact that we have to be honest in recovery gives people permission to not only be unkind, but to really be hurtful. And sometimes people think of the disclosure process as that too. And I think it's really important to understand where that balance is, and what the difference between brutal honesty and being honest is, and working an honest program. But I guess my point is that it really requires a reworking of every part of our lives. How we do our self-care, how is our self-talk, the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we tell other people, how we interact with people, having the courage. A lot of times I think we have to be honest when we make a mistake. And that was really hard for me, because I had a lot of shame anyway, and I just didn't want to be caught making a mistake, and it was an honest mistake. But boy, what a growth experience to be able to be honest about that and say, hey, look, I messed up, and this is what happened. And that's such a relief to do that. And honestly, people really react well to that for the most part. I think people appreciate that honesty, when we can admit we were wrong, when we can do something that needs to be corrected, when we can make amends. All those things are recovery-based processes that really move us closer toward a healthy recovery, and move us farther away from that addiction, which was so just completely full of dishonest thoughts and minimizations and rationalizations and all that stuff. And so I guess the bottom line for me, and it's kind of like, I've done a lot of work with resilience, and it's we used to think, resilience is a trait, or it's not, and resilience is really a skill to be learned. I think honesty, you'd think, okay, that's pretty black and white. But I think sometimes for an addict who's lived in a dishonest world for so long, it's kind of hard to find your way out and find the truth. I mean, that sounds kind of ridiculous on its face, but I think a lot of people struggle with knowing what the reality is at first. And that's what I think they have to rely on other people. But bottom line is that we have to be impeccable at our efforts at being honest. And it starts with us being honest with ourselves, but certainly with people in our lives. We think about partners that have been traumatized by behaviors, and how repeated dishonesty just continues that trauma, continues that wounding. And that happens in all our relationships, and to the point where it's really damaged. And then, which brings me to my final point, which is kind of that recovery process, especially for sex addiction, where the addict is on a different time frame, usually wants to be brought back into the fold sooner than the partner is willing to feel safe doing that. And I think we have to be, that's where that total honesty it's very fragile. And I think if we do things that are dishonest by omission even, or vague, or I would even include being non-specific about things. I think as clear cut as we can be, to the point of being a little bit too much, is probably a good thing in the beginning. So it's something we have to strive for. I think it's a skill, if you will, and I think we have to kind of do a lot of deprogramming of the way we've been taught to think for a long time, for most of our lives, and then really practice being honest. So I think that's all I have to say on that.
So we would invite questions at the bottom of your screen. You'll see Q&A. We would invite you on this topic or anything else. And I was really thinking when you started off that, that lying goes with addiction. And when people call me, they go, he lies or she lies, but all the time. And I'm going, yes, absolutely, including to ourselves. And I think that is so key. I also noted when you're talking about, the programming, and I thought, there's a lot of people that grow up in environments where telling the truth was not safe. That was not the culture that they were raised in. And there were real reasons why lying, yes, it's to avoid consequences for addiction and all that too. But I've heard lots of people's stories, and, there were reasons why it was not okay to tell the truth in the family environment or anything else. So it's really old patterns, across the board. I also think when you talked about with other people, and that is so critical, because it's really easy for me early on. I really don't struggle with it anymore. So that tells you recovery can work. But the early on, I needed to have a sounding board. I needed other people, because what I think was always dangerous, but what I would think, to get that feedback, from other people of yes, I see that, or no, have you thought about this, or whatever. But just being able to learn those skills. And I do agree that it's not just you're either born, we're all born, to be honest, but we learn to be dishonest. But the freedom of not having to keep track of who I told what to, and getting caught in all of that, the chaos, I don't miss any of that. But I really do believe that unless we're able to, they talk about it in the big book, there are unfortunately some who are incapable of being honest with themselves. There are such unfortunates, and that is tragic if people absolutely cannot be honest with themselves, because then, then there is little hope. But in my world, in the recovery world, I see lots of hope of people that learn a little at a time, to be truthful. I know the clinical director at Seeking Integrity says, tell the truth and tell it faster.
Right.
Only
Right.
in addiction do you have to talk about that.
Right. This one more point on something you touched on. It's so true that a lot of us grew up in dysfunctional households, whether it's addiction or mental illness or some other kind of dysfunction. And what we saw as kids, what we were told wasn't true. We would see stuff and think this is what's going on, but all the adults would say, no, that's not what you're seeing. Don't believe your lying eyes, kind of thing. And it's very confusing for kids, because so we're right off the bat where there's a mixed message about honesty and dishonesty. So I think it's entirely confusing for kids too.
But my biggest thing is get support, get other people to be your sounding board. I a couple of years ago, I had something, and it was a righteous email of, and I thought, oh, I better call this person that knows both of us. And as soon as I did, he was like, Tammy, you don't want to send that email. And he told me why. And I knew I wasn't supposed to send that email, but but I wanted to be brutally honest with that person. I want to talk about that too. So getting that sounding board of like, like how do I navigate the world has been, incredibly helpful for me. And you touched on disclosure, and brutally honest in disclosure is only if you've got therapy and help, doing I'm going to tell you everything and I'm going to feel better. I'm going to be brutally honest and tell you everything is more damaging to betrayed partners. I also like that you said it's really easy to be brutally honest with other people about their behavior and keep them, I'm holding the mirror up to you so I don't have to look at the mirror myself. And that's self-serving, but on some level, but it really actually is detrimental to each of us personally as well too. So.
Totally.
Okay, first question. What is your advice on starting a relationship with a person with an entirely different addiction? Is it too high a risk or does it have potential to be successful? Sex addict me versus heroin addict. I have never had any interest in drugs, nor have I done any.
I guess the differential factor here would be is there recovery involved? I mean, are these addictions that are active or not? I think if you're both working a program for recovery for your respective addictions, I don't necessarily see any kind of problem with that. But I do think there is, with any addict, there's a potential to transfer addictive behaviors. And so I guess it just depends on if it's still going on, then that could be indeed a risk for both of you. So I'd be cautious about that. But I'd be cautious about starting a relationship with anybody who seems to have an active addiction.
It noted that both in active recovery.
Okay.
Tag in how long for each of you, because that also is a factor. Can you add that too, please? Because to me, like the time in recovery is also,
right.
If it's a month, not yet. 97 days for him and 189 days for me.
Okay, so that, to me, that's pretty early, very early to start a relationship. I mean, we talk about whether to have sex or not, or whether to date or not in the first year. I think to start a relationship in the first year is probably a mistake. What I've seen, honestly, from clients, and this is irrespective of what your addictions are, but I think if you're getting involved, what I often see is that the people and decisions they make today are different than they're going to be in 6 months, and those are going to be different than they would be in a year. So I think people in the first year of recovery, especially, are kind of works in progress. I think that we need to be careful just about really focusing on ourselves. The danger, and even if you're both, and I'm sure marvelous people and all that, and have good sound recovery, but the danger is that we can get so easily entangled in the other person, because at that length of sobriety, we're still kind of figuring out who we are. We're figuring out our healthy boundaries. We're figuring out a lot of our internal messages. There's a lot of healing going on inside. So I think I'd just be really, really cautious about that. So I would say the time is almost more of a factor than the nature of the addictions that you have.
And I really agree. It's really easy and more fun to focus on this great new relationship and this person and all the good endorphins that come along with that and everything else, and be distracted and lose track of what I need to do for me in my recovery. Because then it starts being about about the other person, about the drama and all of those type of things. So whenever anybody's dating, highly encourage you to have a great support system that knows that can weigh in and can start going, hey, Dr. Rob talks about this all the time, and I love this analogy. It's like really easy to hang Christmas lights on the other person and go, they're amazing, and miss the things that would be warning signs if we were using this part of our brain. So I think it's really important. Recovery is primary. If I keep my recovery first, and I'm so glad you're here and you're asking the question, but keep our recovery first. What do we need to be in recovery? Because we got nothing if we lose that. So
the other thing I've seen happen, and it's one of the reasons we are cautious about doing trauma therapy too soon, is that in early recovery, our capacity to deal with feelings and being upset and all that stuff is somewhat limited, right? We can be very easily triggered, and and relapse. And so I think, so I've seen relationships like this that, not like this, but relationships that get together at an early sobriety date, and then there's complications, they break up, and very often one or both relapses because it's just overwhelming for their emotional coping ability. So yeah, just a lot of caution, a lot of caution.
So the floor is open. Other questions? So while we're waiting, let's talk about your new book, because you know how much I was like, we need a book across all the addictions, and I mean across all the different chemicals, because we're consistently, I'm getting the calls of people who are using a lot of cannabis while cannabis was legalized. So people perceive that it's okay now, but can we talk a little bit about that, about how different, like if somebody's using a lot of cannabis, or they're like using a lot of alcohol, or they're using a lot of stimulants or opiates, like what are they looking for, and how does that play into sex addiction?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I'm happy to talk about that. My original work was with mostly amphetamines and sex, and that's really the classic combination because they go well together, and a lot of work in that. But that really kind of led to this artificial perception out there that that's a problem of gay men or of certain limited populations. But what we're seeing more and more actually is kind of everybody's kind of coming out of the closet in terms of combining drugs and sex. And I think it's just as general as we start to, each of us has more and more addictive behaviors if we're an addict. I was kind of a good old alcoholic, but I think a good old alcoholic is hard to find these days because everybody's doing multiple drugs, multiple behaviors, and it's just a whole different thing. And so really what the book does is recognize the fact that different populations, whether you're a female or male or gay or straight or somewhere in between, has the potential to fuse some kind of drug behavior with sex. And people come at it from different approaches. We find that the amphetamine users tend to be kind of the intensity junkies that really go for that kick. But other people, like you just said, a lot of marijuana that people now are getting the perception it's a pretty benign drug. It's legal, but what could be wrong? And it's a problem sometimes when it gets fused with sexual behavior. So people will get high with cannabis. It's kind of a body high, and it gets them in the mood, and that becomes very quickly associated with sex and the urge to have sex, or porn, or some kind of sexual behavior. And so it doesn't really matter whatever drug it is. And there are a few drugs that aren't as common. Even opioids, for example, are not necessarily thought of as a sexual drug, but I see people using it. So different people have different kinds of natures that where certain drugs appeal to them, whether they want to be kind of numbed or kind of depressant drugs or stimulant drugs. And then any of those can feed in combination with sexual behavior, including not just the co-occurring where they occur at the same time, but what we're calling cross addiction, where people use a substance to kind of numb or distance themselves from some sexual attraction they may be uncomfortable with or have shame about. So there's all kinds of ways this manifests. And I think this book explores that, and more importantly, it really provides a lot of tools and skills that people can apply to these situations. So I'm really excited about it.
I am too. It was just one of those where otherwise it's just one little niche, and I'm like, this is too much information that is needed out in the general population. So I'm very excited to have that. So we've got a question from Australia. I'm a 31-year-old and from a male, never had a girlfriend. I acted out with sex workers and porn in my addiction till now. I'm working to get recovery, but I find it hard to see a future, and now don't find any joy in recovery or addiction. I think my addict part is slowly trying to convince of chemsex. Any advice for me?
Wow, great question. Yeah, I do have some advice. When we experience a lot of that intensity from acting out with escorts or with sex online or with porn, or especially with amphetamines, what we start to see is our brains kind of shift and get used to that high level of intensity. And when we start to come back on it, or cut back, it's like our brains are having a little tantrum. They want that stimulation. And so the way that looks and feels is a sense of hopelessness, a sense of low energy, like a depression, a lot of impulsivity, So it was really a kind of a risky and uncomfortable state for people. So I would suggest that a lot of what you're feeling is the result of kind of cutting back, and it's kind of a withdrawal that can be a prolonged withdrawal. We could talk about post-acute withdrawal, where to 6 months you can have people experiencing these kind of weird symptoms with low-grade depression and hopelessness and sleepiness and irritability and even some physical stuff. So I don't give up hope at all. Just engage in recovery. I'd suggest you talk to people who are a little farther down the path than you are, because that's always was helpful for me, and I think it's been helpful for my clients if they are stuck in this 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, or early recovery somehow, and think of relapsing, think I'm never going to get past this. But they need to talk to people and find that you can get past it for sure. So I would make sure you engage, get connected, get a little recovery community for yourself, and don't give it up, because there's a lot of hope. It's interesting. I know just from colleagues there, Australia has a slightly different approach to chemsex. There's a lot of resistance to it in the professional field. So I'm getting a lot of people in my podcasts and webinars from Australia and my meetings, the chemsex meeting on Tuesday night, where they can talk about it. There's no opportunity to talk about it down there. So if you need to, with Zoom meetings, expand your reach and find the support you need, because it is out there.
So let's talk about, so on Tuesday nights, Dr. David is on a different platform, intherooms.com, every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern time, 5 p.m. Pacific, correct? You just muted out. I can't hear you. I always say these are the Pink Floyd moments.
Sorry, Tammy.
Your lips are moving and I can't hear what you say. So.
That is correct.
Okay, so on intherooms.com, you can find him on Tuesday nights. Dr. Rob is on, not chemsex, but he has his sex, love, and addiction on that platform on Friday nights at 6 p.m. Pacific time. Oh, I lost my train of thought with the mute. But Dr. David is doing a chemsex 4-week lecture and interactive series that will start in March. I forgot which date now. Thank you. It's 90 minutes for 4 weeks. That is a paid feature. Everything else is free, but that one, it's a small group. The guys have found it really helpful. That's on seekingintegrity.com. Consider that, or anybody, from Australia or anywhere. It's a really great opportunity to dig in and learn more and work directly with Dr. David. So consider that, but there are resources. The other thing I was going to say is there's a reason why we in 12-step talk about one day at a time. It's because if we start focusing on the nevers and forevers and always and all that, like that's still quicksand for me. I don't think I will relapse today, but it's just bad thinking. So I would invite you, can you just for today not act out? Can you choose a recovery minded thing? You're here, great. Are there things that you can do just today? And man, the days just kind of tick away and you go, gosh, all of a sudden I've got this a period of time. And then like Dr. David was talking about, like, I think, the brain fog and the withdrawal, start to clear. Also being very intentional about having a gratitude list. I literally, for a long time, very early in recovery, every single day, and I still do it from time to time. I can do it more mentally now, but I wrote out, at least 3 things that I was grateful for in that day. And you cannot be grateful and be sad and depressed. You can't. So just even for that moment while I'm writing, I'm in gratitude, and that, then I'm also going like, oh, okay, these are good things, so that can help shift things, a bit as well. So,
right.
Okay. Next question. What is your thought on EFT counseling for couples? And explain that one too. What is a good time to start if the recovery process? It's emotionally focused therapy, but how does it compare to doing couples work in RCA, which is Recovering Couples Anonymous? What should we look for in an EFT counselor? And should this be someone different than my husband's CSAT and my trauma counselor? So thoughts on couples work?
Yeah, a great question, and good for you, kind of expanding possible things that might be helpful. So Yeah, emotionally focused therapy for freedom. There's different ways of talking about it, but it all involves healing, alternative healing techniques, basically, and most of it focused on tapping and energy points in the body, very similar to the meridians that acupuncture uses. And there's a lot of awareness of kind of the body system, innate body systems that can carry the addiction and carry. What I like about it, and it's similar to other trauma therapies in that it addresses the non-cognitive, kind of non-verbal part of addiction. You know, addiction is certainly about thoughts and ideas, but a lot of addictive behavior, especially when it's related to trauma, has what we call a somatic component. It's a physiological. Trauma gets kind of embedded in our wiring, in our neurological system, and some of these techniques that involve movement and awareness of those meridians and breathing, all of them are really, I think, useful and sometimes essential for the trauma work specifically. In terms of in terms of couples, I think it's really a fascinating idea because a lot of the work can be done in pairs. I think I, for some years, I did something called breath work, and it was done in pairs. And it's quite. I didn't do it with my partner, but it was a very intimate experience nonetheless because you're really sharing. Sometimes there's tears, sometimes there's laughter.
Mm-hmm.
Usually there's some relief. There's some release of long-held tension. So I think that kind of intimacy between the two of you could be really kind of marvelous, actually. A lot of those techniques don't really carry a lot of risk per se. Sometimes emotions can kind of get large and that you release them. There is, once in a while, people can have a real kind of cathartic moment, and then that, depending, I guess, on your circumstances and the nature of your past and any trauma you might have had, you might want to evaluate that with your therapist. If it should be under the supervision of a therapist, or if it's something you could do with instruction at home. But I would see what they're comfortable with. But I really love the idea of incorporating sort of non-cognitive talk therapy into your recovery because that is an essential piece. And for me, I think it also has a benefit from a sex addiction point of view because sex addiction is so fantasy and thought based. I mean, it's all up here, right? And so many couples when they're healing and trying to reestablish intimacy, try to do it with thoughts, trying to get that arousal fantasy going in the way that they used to with porn or methamphetamine or sex escorts, you know. So I think it's not, you'll never match the level of dopamine trying to get an alternate fantasy with your wife or husband, right? It's just going to be different. But I think this ability to connect through your body is just, it kind of as a workaround from that fantasy-based arousal. And believe me, your body will remember how to get aroused. If you touch, if it's safe, if it's healthy, you know, communication back and forth. And that kind of physical technique really does start to establish those bonds. So I think it'd be a great idea. I would definitely get instruction on it and work with a counselor for it to guide yourself. But I think it could be a great adjunct to trauma therapy. And you certainly talk about your trauma therapist. And some CSATs are trained in it, others are not. It's kind of an adjunct for a CSAT. But yeah, I think the more of those kind of techniques, the better. I think that there's very low risk and there's a lot of potential payoff.
So I'm going to touch on the RCA. RCA is not therapy. That's going to be more 12 steps. So, you know, when you're going to EFT counseling or doing couples counseling, that's with a trained mental health professional. So the RCA can be a great supplemental, you know, couples work. But, you know, couples therapy is very different. I do want to mention we have a new couples series starting again, the Couples Healing from Betrayal workshop. We used to do them live in our office, and then COVID hit, so we quit doing that. So we've changed it to an online presence. It went really well. It was 90 minutes. We're going to change it to 2 hours. It is starting again April 8th. So if you're interested in that, on Seeking Integrity, on the online lectures and workshops, you'll see that. And that's guided. We're going to talk about, you know, the communication, healthy sexuality. I mean, there's grieving losses together. There's a bunch of things in there that are topical, but also with some practical exercises in that. Then the last thing I want to mention on this is, you know, should you do something different? A lot of times people, as couples work with their with both therapists in a conjoint session. That's my thick Midwest accent. Can you tell? Conjoint probably. But anyway, so both of your therapists and both of you. So that is another way of looking at it rather than another therapist. And all of those work. So as long as there's communication and there's safety in it, in the process, see what works for you. So
I want to add one more thing. I'm putting it in the
sure.
text. There's a really wonderful couples exercise called Sensate Focus. I talk about it a lot. It's Masters and Johnson. It's a weird name, so I'm going to type it out there. But what it is, it's a kind of progressive intimacy building communication exercise for couples. And they divide it's probably 50 years old now, but it's really powerful. And it starts out non-sexual, but you have a pleasurer and a receiver basically, and you take turns. But the pleasurer is guided by the receiver, and their hand, it's touch, it's nonverbal, and you stroke, you tickle, you rub, you pinch, and the hand is guided to different places, and by the receiver who communicates back, that's too hard, too soft, that's good, that's not, and basically you explore, and it's just a great way of kind of rewiring how we connect to people, and I've had couples who were together 20 years who did this series of exercises and found out things about each other they never knew. So it's a really intimate way, and it's another way of kind of doing something different to try to reestablish that energy between the two.
And I did actually share that with somebody else who was reaching out, and I said, Dr. David often suggests that. So I shared that in an email I was responding to today. So
Great.
So I pay attention when I'm talking to you. It's 7 weeks from my partner's porn addiction relapse. I'm so sorry, but I'm glad you're here. He is doing a program called The Mindful Habit. I'm not familiar with that, and doing these live Q&As and watching your podcast with your organization, but is not working with a CSAT. How do I approach him to be honest with me and do disclosure of the recent relapse without a CSAT? We cannot afford the fees of the one we've looked into.
Yikes. So yeah, disclosure is a really important and very formalized process. And it's formalized to protect against some of the things we spoke about at the beginning of this webinar tonight in terms of the potential issues of brutal honesty and honesty itself, and how to share, and sharing too much or not sharing enough, or omission. And a lot of those questions are so loaded emotionally for both parties that it's really useful to have guides basically to walk you through it. Plus, it's a very formal process where typically both individuals have their own therapists. The therapists communicate each other beforehand. Documents are going back and forth, and there's a lot of formal process about it. So I'd be concerned about trying to do it on your own somehow. For all the pitfalls that can happen out there. I'm trying to think, Tammy, have I seen something recently about disclosure workshops, maybe?
They are, but they're like a 3-day, I mean, it's not just so if fees are an issue, possibly as part of the mindful habit, like I said, I've never heard of it, so I don't know anything about that, but they may have something about disclosure about that. I guess when I'll give you this very brief. Dr. Rob talks about doing disclosure, and it's like a page and a half of it. This is the kind of thing. It is not, and then I looked at this or whatever, but it would include, like this is porn, so it's different, but I've had unprotected sex, X amount of times, I spent this amount of money, whatever. It's that kind of data so that you have that. It isn't like, I was watching this porn and, it's got these kind of babes on it, or what. I mean, it's not, it's not graphic details that are going to be stuck in your brain. So it's really about, getting the data that you need to create safety. Often with partners, it's easy to, have 100 questions. And Dr. Rob just talked about this on Monday night. He said, if you have 100 questions and they all get answered, you're going to have another one and another one. And so that never stops. So that's why we really say working with, a qualified person. So people unfortunately do disclosures amongst each other all the time. And unfortunately, it's usually, I want to feel better, I'm going to tell you everything. And, then you as the partner are left holding the bag. So proceed super carefully. Make sure you've got great support.
Yeah.
If you can't afford a therapist, then please be on. We've got another betrayed partner drop-in group at 8:30 tomorrow morning, free. There's a bunch of resources where you can get support for you, because that's really key to all of this, is making sure that you have the support as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's
Okay.
the best bet. Yeah.
So the next question, what about if I'm in an existing relationship with a sex porn addict who is active, says he wants to work on changing behavior, but thinks he can do it without help? I'll keep reading because I just want to go. We all think, oh, I can change it. I can do it. I can do it different this time. It is better to stay in the relationship, or is it more of a detriment to him if I remain without the consequence of him continuing changing the behavior?
Great question. I'm sorry about the situation too. I think, um, like Tammy said, I think every addict goes through a time when they can do it themselves. I certainly did numerous times, numerous ways.
Today is going to be different.
Yeah, and we're totally working on some unrelated problem that had nothing to do with my addiction. I became, for example, a vegan when I was really an alcoholic. That's going to solve
Oh,
everything. Now I
it
eat
didn't
meat.
work out so well, did it?
No, it didn't work out. So I think that's part of the kind of delusion that every addict has. So I think, so certainly to get connected in recovery programs and 12-step programs, and just get that support. But it's a tricky situation because the person that we were talking about being honest with ourselves and honest with others. The person's not being honest with ether. He's certainly not being honest with himself, or you. And so I think it's a real problem. Now, boundaries, boundaries are for you. Boundaries are to protect you. Boundaries are consequences. And I think I think we mentioned this last week or some other time recently, where if you establish a boundary, you have to really be prepared to follow through. And I think there's nothing worse for either of you than setting a boundary, then it kind of fizzles away. So really be cautious about that. I really think it through. I would make sure you get the support and talk these kind of decisions through with someone outside of your relationship that is familiar, either the therapist or some kind of recovery support group that could help you walk your way through this. I think, though, given his level of kind of denial, it may take some kind of statement like that on your part to kind of set a limit, whether that's leaving the relationship or a temporary separation or something. But I think I've seen, and I don't know if this is the case for you, but I've seen couples kind of in this dance that can go on for a long time until something really bad happens. And so I'd really, it's probably not something you want to avoid and hope it gets better, but really kind of think about what you can do to take care of yourself and perhaps take care of the relationship. But he's got to ultimately face it on his own. But he may not do that without a little bit of a push or consequence.
Yeah, I share this all the time. No addict changes until the pain of changing is less than the pain of what we're experiencing in that moment. So, and I answer the phone, and it's constantly, I need help now. And then, 2 days later, I'm following up with them, and it's like, oh, I'm going to try that. So this is so typical. But I wonder, it doesn't have to be like I'm out of the relationship. There can be, like Dr. David said, boundaries for your safety. But we have a lot of guys that, that dip their toe in this by going to the sex and porn addiction 101 level work group. It's pretty easy because you go online, it's 90 minutes, it's facilitated, and then they start connecting the dots. And it can be, here's what I need from you is I would need to see that you're doing this, or you're doing a drop-in group or a 12-step or whatever you need for you to see that he's actually doing something. But I've been in recovery a while, and I don't know anybody who has successfully navigated doing it on their own that changed. Then they're the dry drunk where they're a miserable human being. So, that doesn't help you either. So, but healthy, safe boundaries for you, that we both encourage that. Okay. How do you break the barrier of what he has now turned into entirely different love languages? Oh, interesting. After 4 years in a relationship, when it once was the same as the first 3 years, basically the past year and a half, been a lot of infidelity on my part due to drifting apart and personality changes. Yet he's forgiven every infidelity situation, especially now that I'm doing this step work for SA. Hmm.
I'm sorry, I got to read that again. How do you, what has, um, hmm. Yes, so I think, again, there's kind of it's kind of the reverse here, almost the kind of a dysfunctional kind of pattern, but here's from the point of view of the addict being forgiven repeatedly and kind of making it okay. And I think that's, and again, I've seen people stay in that kind of dance for a long time until it spins out of control. No one can sustain it forever. I mean, we know the ending. We just don't know how soon it happens, right? If you stay on that path. So I think I would really, congratulations, by the way, for doing step work in SA. And I think, I don't know if your partner is getting support either, but I think it's, I don't know, there's a difference between forgiveness and enabling somehow. And I think, I'm not sure where that all stands here, but I think I would suggest getting some kind of couples therapist or outside person who can really help you and evaluate that. I like the idea of love languages. I'm not sure quite how it fits into this scenario, though. I'm trying to understand that to reread it. But what we do know that addiction certainly changes the nature of relationships and how people connect with each other and how people communicate with each other. And that can really get damaged, if not permanently damaged, by some of these relapses and ongoing behavior. So I think both of you really need to take care of yourselves, and you with your own recovery, and vice versa with the support. And then I think I would suggest a third professional person to really kind of help guide the healing and what comes next.
And I think communication is critical, and it's interesting that the love language has changed, because I'm, like, you unload the dishwasher, you do the dishes. I am a happy lady. I'm real happy. That's my love language. Gifts and stuff are nice, but like, some people just need to have the gifts. I mean, so having the language of love, I understand it's different, and understanding what the other person's language of love is, so that you can reach into their area, is absolutely critical. So
Yeah, absolutely.
I think professionals helping guide this would be a great choice. But I'm glad you're going to SA and getting help. That's great. Discovery was August of 18, after 28 years of marriage. Months of trickle truths, twisted truths, fabricated stories, changing stories, etc. I told him his continued lying was destroying us, as you were talking about before. In preparation for disclosure, summer of 2019, discovered he was not being totally honest with his therapist, so I kicked him out, and we've been separated since. I don't feel safe. He started seeing a second therapist, finally had a therapeutic disclosure this past August. So that would be 2 years after the initial. Oh, that's a long time. But good. Via Zoom, and I watched him lie. Oh no, that's not good. Lie right to all our faces. Disclosure ended not answering my questions, as there is no way I could trust what he was saying. He has weekly individual and group therapy, going to SAA as a sponsor, but just now on step 9. We both want to stay married and work through this, but I can't feel safe unless he can be totally honest and transparent with me. He just doesn't get it or doesn't want to. Now I'm scared if he will ever be safe to let him come home. Thoughts?
Wow. I'm sorry for all the situations you've been going through. We were talking tonight earlier about sometimes addicts just have this inability to get honest. Now, and I have honestly seen that in most cases people really can. I mean, that's a very small exception. So I don't give people too much slack saying, well, I'm just constitutionally incapable. No, you're not. You just need to be honest. So I think so that he's obviously still very much in his disease. The torment of those kind of trickling disclosures, as you put it, is horrible. And then to have a formal disclosure and then have it also be filled with lies and dishonesty is just that much more hurtful. So I, until he really gets honest, I don't know that there's much potential for change and recovery on his part. And certainly I don't think there's any way that you're going to feel any closer to your goal of being safe or feeling safe emotionally. And so I think this is a case where, really firm boundaries are necessary. You take care of you, and he really needs to do the work, and he needs to do the work, I think, on his own for a while, frankly, because it becomes a game, and not even a conscious game. Sometimes manipulative, but sometimes just, as I said, I talked about it as a dance before. Couples get in this thing where they do this kind of repeat. And so I think you have to break the cycle. And that may mean a more determinative separation, like time out, whatever that means. But this is not, it's not working well for you. And I don't see where there's an impetus to change on his part. He's kind of stuck in this mode. And I will say, and this is not unusual, when especially sex addicts and porn addicts are in that bubble, they're kind of, and not to excuse it because they're still responsible for the behavior, but they're disconnected from a lot of the emotional impact. That's why we do impact letters of the harm they're doing. And so I suspect he doesn't really understand the extent of the lack of safety and trauma that he's putting you through. But nonetheless, I think you need to take care of you. That may mean more separation of physical space or some kind of boundaries there to protect you. And I hope, and this sounds terrible, but I hope he has something that is a kind of a serious wake-up call for him, because he may die. I mean, people die from this. And so it's a serious situation. It takes a special kind of addict, I think, to sit through disclosure and lie with all those people and all that formal process. And so, we also find sometimes there's other issues. Maybe there's personality issues. There's other kinds of stuff going on that may be impacting some of this too. So I just don't know. I don't know the case. But I think all I can say really is to take care of you, and really, I wouldn't put up with too much more unless you see real signs of change.
And I hear that now I'm scared it will never be safe for him to come home. That's real. And I understand that. But like Dr. David was saying, take care of you and think about, like you're more than 2 years, you're 2.5 years in at this point, and things aren't changing. So, and I'm not, if it's working for you, great. But if, at the end of this year, at the end of next year, if this is still the dance you're doing, is that what you want to be caught in? So, so looking at you, safety, financial, emotional, physical, what do you need to be safe? And to me, I mean, I would love to have them come to Seeking Integrity. This is the kind of stuff that we address. Like I said, our clinical director says, tell the truth and tell it faster. We're constantly challenging on untruths. I get partners all the time that he's going to lie. Yes, he is. And we know it. And we're going to, keep unpacking things, and we're not going to get him to be 100% fixed in 14 days or, have, this amazing, now I tell the truth at all costs, but they've got a plan. So it can be different.
And I just want to say too, I was just rereading this, 28 years of marriage, that's a long time. So I totally get the trepidation about, starting over, starting a new life, separating I've been married a long time too, and your lives get so entangled, everything financially, emotionally. So I totally get that. But this is not probably the life that you want to lead. So hard choices, I think.
Yeah. Kids, grandkids, I mean, whatever, but it's, it's hard on everyone, but the pain of, I'm scared, like he's not safe, and I don't see him, in just what was shared, moving towards really wanting to do what's best for the relationship. So it sounds very self-centered in addiction yet. So okay, so D-Day will be a year in March. So partners sober since D-Day, yay. We are doing well. I, the betrayed partner, have been in S&On meeting for 8 months, just not very helpful. What else should I look into? Yes. Okay, so there's codependence, moving beyond codependency. And I just got the link. Let's see. I'm going to type this into the chat. It's called We Tonglen, and I don't know what that means. but I will type it in, and you have to go in and join. But I just learned about it today, and there's a number of people that go into that group that are on all our drop-ins and everything else. So Dr. Rob wrote a book called Prodependence, Moving Beyond Codependency, and they get that. It's very different. There's also there's a new website, prodependence.org, that we'll talk about doing 12-step meetings, but all of our drop-in groups for betrayed partners, and I mentioned earlier, there's one on tomorrow morning at 8:30 a.m. There was one today. There were 50 women there. The Sunday night one had 60. So I did the old lady posse. There were 57. I mean, so people are connecting on those sites, and all from a prodependent lens, not codependency. You're not codependent. You're not an enabler. You're not part of the problem. That you love somebody who's broken, and the opposite of addiction is healthy attachment. So being in a healthy, connected relationship is important. People in an active addiction can't show up for the oh, thank you. Thank you. I was gonna, so I'm gonna share that with everybody. Let's see if I can multitask. Okay. Nope, no, I didn't do it. So it's Wee Tonglen. That's such an attractive thing on the case. Sorry about that. But anyway, so you have to ask to join, and they ask a little series of questions. But yeah, I've been on it for a couple hours, and I've just perused a little bit of it, but it looks like a very supportive place. I'd invite you to check that out. But again, the drop-in groups on sexandrelationshiphealing.com. There's a bunch of them for betrayed partners. And I mentioned earlier, there's going to be a new one for attachment wounds for betrayed partners that will start March 18th. So it'll be Thursdays at 11 a.m. Pacific time. And like with all the 12 steps, take what you need and leave the rest. Like there's a lot of good stuff in S&On and all of those about healthy boundaries and things like that, and support. When it starts turning into the codependent, you're part of the problem. That's where we go a different direction. So,
and I'll say, the format is just slightly different enough, I think, to be sometimes really helpful, in that these webinars, very much like this, we talk about stuff, we comment. There sometimes could be, I guess, what we call crosstalk, if people post a question that relates to something before, and I think sometimes that's really helpful to kind of learn. It makes it for a rich conversation. There's a lot of information. It's relatable. I think that's a slight difference there. And these webinars are facilitated too, so they're guided in a way that I think really helps. So yeah, I encourage you to check those out.
Yeah, I think with the new one that we're creating, like the others are open format, and people share, and it kind of takes off from there. But like with the attachment wounds, like he will be guiding that, to talk. So Troy Love will be the host. He does the Friday men's group, and he's got a workbook called Finding Peace, and it really, like, he did the webinar earlier today, but we talk about those attachment wounds, and and I told him, I said, I've spent enough time with him that, like, now I can see, oh, I'm bumping up against somebody's abandonment wound or whatever it is, and I can change how I'm saying or how I'm reacting so that I can help de-escalate it. Or I can go, oh, they're bumping up against my betrayal wound, or
Exactly.
like it changes things, because I have this awareness of, I can do it differently, and I can see what's happening just in that moment, which instead of escalating and getting into a fight, it's helpful. So yes. Is there a way to find this .com? Yes. So I'm going to type, so all of these things are sex and relationship healing.com. But the Wee Tonglen, it was just weetonglen.com. So you just add a .com at the end of that one. But on sexandrelationshiphealing.com, on events or online groups, you'll see all the different things, and we've got new ones coming. So keep checking in on that. So
great.
So
Wonderful.
okay, I think we're out of time. Thank you all for joining us again tonight. And so Dr. David will be on this platform again next Wednesday, and on intherooms.com on Tuesday nights for the chemsex group. But lots of resources. Please keep joining us, and the seekingintegrity.com, the work groups that I mentioned, great resources, affordably priced for those work groups, really solid help. So
Great.
Thank you, my friend. See you
Thanks,
soon.
Tammy. Okay, good night, everybody.
Bye.